enabled it to happen. And I'm speaking about mainly what I would call in the United States a liberal class, to a certain degree in this country, a liberal class. They told us that only the status quo, only a corrupt, warmongering status quo will be acceptable to the majority. Their surprise will have their hyperventilating and their frustration and their frenzied reaction to this for a long time. They've created Trump. They've created Trump in the same way they created Blair, in the same way that others like these people, like the kind of populist that Trump is, in the United States, they corrupted a voting system within the Democratic Party that ensured that another populist, Bernie Sanders, I don't think really he would have beaten Trump, but he was a populist, but instead the corrupt candidate, the embodiment of the status quo that has declared the whole world a battlefield, was the candidate of sanity, the candidate for women. This grotesque campaigning for a candidate for a person who represented great rapacious power has been probably the most eye-opening side to this. I don't think Trump was coming. You could see him coming a mile off, or a Trump.
But before we move to Trump, just remind us, you mentioned rapacious power there, of quite how the rest of the world, particularly the global south, views Hillary Clinton like some sort of embodiment of evil. Why?
I don't know why they view her as the embodiment of evil. I mean, she is clearly the embodiment of a corrupt system. She is the embodiment of a very dangerous warmongering system that has declared the world a place where it can go to war wherever it likes, where it can bomb agricultural communities in Yemen, where half the children are malnourished, where it can do what it likes in Syria, do what it likes in Iraq. I think most of humanity regards that kind of behavior from the allegedly most powerful country in the world as abhorrent. And she is has been the embodiment of that. Now, whether Trump will be is an open question. He says he's anti-establishment, but of course he'll come with his own establishment. He's anti their establishment. I don't believe for a moment that he's anti the wider establishment of the United States. Indeed, he's a product of it. But, you know, the shock surprise is the same as the Brexit vote. A kind of how dare these people vent their frustrations at the ballot box. The truth is there was no one to vote for in the United States. There was perhaps Sanders earlier on, but he was a kind of a minority populist candidate with a large following, yes. But the system threw up those who could afford it. Trump had his own money. Clinton was backed by the Democratic Party. Clinton was backed by the arms company. She was the only candidate that among her financial backers included all but one of the 10 leading arms manufacturers in the world. People, for all kinds of reasons, don't like this. Mainly, the main reason is what has happened to their lives. The way a corrupt banking system has destroyed their lives, has destroyed jobs, destroyed whole cities and towns, the towns that the Democratic Party once claimed to represent. That's what they don't like, and that's why they voted for Trump. I would have thought they would have voted for a Trump. He articulated it very well. There's no question about that. But a Trump coming along up against a candidate representing this corrupt status quo, this corrupt establishment, would have won.
But even elites that are part of that corruption surely need to know facts on the ground. Why the elites and all the media which goes along with it, NBC, ABC, CNN, BBC over here, why would the journalists, why would the people themselves not want to know the facts and realize that Trump was going to win? Because you said you weren't surprised, yet they seem surprised.
They're not journalists. They're anti-journalists. One of the most revealing aspects of this has been the exposure of journalism. The exposure of journalism as an extension of that same corrupt, established power that I've been speaking about. They're not independent. They are echo chambers. They amplify and echo that which is handed down to them. Look, and the worst, of course, the greatest echoes are the so-called enlightened, respectable, liberal press. The New York Times has become a kind of Cold War propaganda sheet with all the nonsense about Russia interfering in this campaign. The Guardian has given up. Yesterday, we had in The Guardian an article called The Hall of Shame by Jonathan Friedland, in which he pointed the finger at a truth teller like Julian Assange, as if he would be to blame if Hillary Clinton, this paragon of liberal virtue, was defeated. It was grotesque. That's not journalism. And whether journalists now stand back, if they can believe, they can sulk and wring their hands and say, we have somebody now is a monster. Not at all. There was a monstrous situation applied in the United States, and journalists enabled it. In a sense, they created Trump.
The liberals, the pro-Hillary people.
Yes, the media, because the media, along with the Pentagon, the CIA, the State Department, and all the rest, including the Republican Party, were Trump's opponents. But they were the shouters. They were the shouters. The BBC, CNN, as I mentioned, The Guardian, New York Times, and, you name it. They were all there because Hillary Clinton represented them.
Okay, well, millions of people have watched your film that you made on Saturday, that was broadcast on Saturday. You mentioned Assange. Assange in that film said that he wouldn't be allowed to win Donald Trump. But certainly if Hillary had been in power, not Trump, if Hillary was president-elect, would we expect pressure on the Ecuadorian government and him just extradited out? Is there more hope for him?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I'm not a futurist. I can't predict. Trump could turn out pretty much the same.
But he's been extolling the virtues of WikiLeaks.
Trump, no one really listened to Trump's narrative, as it were. They saw only this salacious side of Trump, getting Trump, in a sense, demonizing Trump. He certainly demonized himself, of course, but now it's different. Now they have to go back through all that news footage and what did that man actually say? What can we expect? Well, they don't know. They don't know, and they're journalists. Extraordinary and shameful.
In the second half, I want to talk about Syria and Iraq, but you mentioned that. We don't know. They don't know. Henry Kissinger, very closely allied to the Clinton campaign. So Jeremy Greenstock was on this show, the Britain's ambassador to the UN, on the other day, and he said, when I was saying Kissinger, Negroponte, Armitage, they're associated with death squads and mass killing, and you're talking at the UN with them like they're important people to know and to get advice from. And he went, they have experience. So
experience of killing people, experience of bankrupting people, experience of starting wars, experience of turning the world into a battleground since 9/11, experience of producing true extremism, these so-called neoconservatives, they were around Hillary Clinton. They may well come back, they may well be drawn to Trump.
Kissinger had some meeting with Trump as well as Clinton.
Well, yes.
Backing.
Well, that's Kissinger. Kissinger, who you know, should have been prosecuted a long time ago. That he appears regularly and is paid on television and is paid by television to appear on. This man is someone who should be prosecuted, and his opinion is sought. I'm not saying that ordinary Americans thought about that, but their own lives, the lives of working people, and the lives of much of the renowned middle class of the United States have been eroded and destroyed in many ways. 2008 destroyed the lives of so many people in the United States. Homes were repossessed, jobs went. Cities that were once thriving became a sort of piles of rust.
And yet a Goldman Sachs candidate was expected to do well in the Rust Belt.
Really? Well, there's always farce and satire. I mean, the whole thing feels like satire. Certainly the reporting and the misrepresentation of this political year has been a kind of black satire, in a sense, you know? And it's something that we in the media really have to come to terms with. I'm not sure we will. The media played a major role in beating drums for the invasion of a country, Iraq, in which probably 1 million people were killed. The media played a major role in the beating of drums for the destruction of Libya, which, as Julian Assange explained in his interview with me, was Libya, the cork in the African bottle, as he described it, created the migrant, so-called migrant refugee crisis, much of it of coming from Africa into the Europe.
Okay, John, we're going to have more on foreign policy in part 2. Thanks for now. Join us after the break. Welcome back. You're watching a Going Underground US election special. With me is award-winning filmmaker and journalist John Pilger. John, before the break, we were talking about Iraq and Libya. Do you think Trump's denunciations of foreign warmongering in the campaign mean that there are signs of hope when it comes to US intervention?
Look, I don't know. They could be seen as signs of hope. If we class Trump as the isolationist, which plays a very significant role in American history, that he draws back, America first. That was the movement. I think he draws from that well, and that means leaving the world be, to a certain degree, for a while. I'm not sure about that. The United States is not run by a president. It's run by a massive national security machine. There's no doubt certain presidents have had very considerable influence, particularly one like Trump, who now has a Republican Senate and House, although a lot of those Republicans were his enemies. So it's a new path to tread. But you know, what has struck me is the silence of those with the facility, with the privilege of being able to analyze and help us understand, to make sense of this extraordinary American year leading up to this extraordinary result. The silence of, particularly of media, and particularly of the so-called liberal class, who have enabled so much of this. Their silence about, first of all, about Iraq, their silence about Libya, more than silence, their collusion with those dreadful events that are so described in Clinton's emails. You know, I think the emails that WikiLeaks published, that Assange spoke about the other day, really exemplify the very corruption. When you have the campaign manager for a candidate for president of the United States is an officially registered agent of Saudi Arabia, and that Saudi Arabia and Qatar are funding the Clinton Foundation, and Clinton, as Secretary of State, is approving arms sales, including the biggest arms sales in history, to Saudi Arabia and Qatar.
And of course, in your interview, Assange used the emails to say that
Yes.
Clinton knew that, according to Clinton, those governments are funding ISIS.
Well, there it was. Clinton said, "We know," and Clinton had known all along. I mean, that's a fact. It's in her own words. She knew that Saudi Arabia, which, as we understand, supplied the nationals for 9/11. Saudi Arabia, which is almost the enemy of humanity in its policies, particularly in the Middle East. There it is, trying to destroy poor, impoverished little Yemen at the moment. These are the friends. These are the friends of the Democratic candidate for president. Is it any wonder that she was beaten?
We do ask the Saudi ambassador on this show, and for comment, we don't get very much. You mentioned the security apparatus that is there, whoever is president. They certainly must have been alarmed when Trump appeared to be, in the establishment's view, weakening NATO by statements about NATO members having to pay their own.
Yes, especially, you know, he at the time of the the Republican National Convention, he demanded that shipment of arms, new arms to NATO, was taken off the platform of the Republican Party. So all kinds of bells must have rung. That's why the CIA so unusually came out against him. That's why the State Department, all those so-called diplomats and others, signed a long letter. That's why the Pentagon did the same thing. He wasn't doing as he was told, in a sense. Now, whether his own establishment, we hold our breath, his own establishment may well do something very similar. There's no question about it. This is not a matter of so-called supporting Trump. That's over. Americans have voted him in as president. But we really we do have a right to understand and analyze the true implications of this and how it got to this.
But in terms of U.S. national security, Saudi Arabia and its ally Israel could retaliate for any possible Trump policy that was going to make a big change.
Yes, they could. All sorts of things could happen, and the United States could decide to make a genuine peace accord with Russia and with Syria, and bring a semblance of order and peace to that country. That could happen as well. I mean, as we speak, the Times in London this week published a story that it seemed to come from official sources that said that NATO was bringing in hundreds of thousands of troops into its right up against the western borders of Russia, Estonia, Poland, and that
British troops
as well. British troops as well. This provocation comes on top of the most venal propaganda that got underway with Ukraine. inverting the truth about a US-managed coup in Ukraine into a Russian invasion. I mean, that's quite an achievement. But in a sense, it worked because it laid the ground for this NATO build-up, the biggest since the Second World War. NATO build-up right on the borders of Russia, exactly where, in 1941, in Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's invasion poured into the Soviet Union. I mean, what greater provocation is there? What recklessness? Now, I don't know what Trump will do about this. He may well go along with it. He likes the Pentagon, he likes the military, he said all that.
I mean, literally in the past 24 hours, while all the election news has been out, the EU has sanctioned Crimea and has said we're going to heap many more sanctions on Crimea. Presumably a president-elect would have ramped up sanctions against Russia.
Something like 40% of the world, in one way or another, is under American sanctions. The EU usually follow on. The EU is not an independent collection of nations. By and large, it follows the United States. Sanctions impose themselves on countries all over the world, destroying life. We'd have infamously, destroying life in Iraq, killing, according to UNICEF, 500,000 infants under the age of 5 between 1991 and 2003. Sanctions led by the United States and Britain.
Okay, I have to mention our interview with Jeremy Greenstock again, the British ambassador to the UN. When I said, why isn't this figure that you just mentioned in his new book, he said, well, that was Saddam Hussein's fault, not the British government's.
Yes, of course it was Saddam Hussein's fault. It's always somebody else's fault. That the bombing and the dismantling of Yugoslavia was entirely Milosevic's fault. It had absolutely nothing to do with Blair's and Clinton's bombing and destruction of so much of that rather fragile federated country. It had absolutely nothing to do with Madeleine Albright in her, when she was then Secretary of State, of deceiving Milosevic and telling him that unless he agreed to the military occupation of his country, then indeed he would be bombed. Madeleine Albright, of course, was Hillary Clinton's, one of Hillary Clinton's most fervent supporters. Of course, it has everything to do with these people. It has everything to do with this imposition of great power around the world. That's the issue. Around the world and in ordinary people's lives, we live in Britain with the imposition of an extreme ideology, with this awful name, neoliberalism. Or, you know, they hauled a perfectly good word out of the dictionary, austerity, and now that's part of the ideology. All of it unnecessary in this rich country. The imposition of power on people's lives is the issue today. And in whatever form it's taken, that's what Americans, the majority of Americans, took to the ballot box with them.
And now I know you've been working on a new film about the ramping up of U.S. tensions with the superpower of this century, as it were, China.
Yeah.
What advice, if you were an appointee in a Trump cabinet or at the State Department, would you say?
Please.
You never know. No one seems
Please.
to. Would you give him about how to change and transform U.S. policy vis-a-vis China?
I wouldn't know where to start. I wouldn't know where to start,
is the policy
how dangerous this is. We have on two fronts. We have in the Northern Hemisphere, up against the border of Russia, the greatest build-up of US-led NATO forces since World War II. In Asia and the Pacific, we have the greatest build-up of US naval forces since World War II, aimed at China. We have something like 800 or 900 US bases around the world, on every continent, 400 of them encircling China. Many more, I think, I haven't counted lately because they keep cropping up encircling Russia. It only needs, I'm not saying that those who are doing this want nuclear war. Even they must understand that it would mean their own destruction. But this recklessness, I've often felt, could lead to the kind of mistake or accident that begins something. And that is all about the imposition of power that comes from within the West. That is the issue. That's the issue that this election campaign has thrown up, and that's the issue about which so many of those, the educated liberal class, those with the privilege of public platforms, have kept silent about. Keeping that out of the campaign in the United States has been a liberal exercise. Keeping it out of the reporting of the campaign in this country has been the same exercise.
John Pilger, thank you. That's it for today. You can join us again on Wednesday when we speak to former Texas Republican Congressman and one-time presidential candidate Ron Paul about Trump's triumph in the White House. In the meantime, get in touch via social media. We'll see you on Saturday, 16 years to the day that Tim Berners-Lee apparently published his first proposal for what would become the World Wide Web.